Hello and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Today we're going to be studying betrothal in the ancient Near East and in the law. You can think of betrothal kind of like engagement. It's a period in the relationship where there's an agreement that two people are going to be married, but they're not married yet, of course, so they're not going to have consummated the marriage. The law only talks about betrothal indirectly. Like in the rest of the law, it really only comes up whenever there's a problem that the law anticipates. And really, the rest of the Old Testament likewise gives us the picture of ancient betrothal in bits and pieces. So we're going to focus mainly on the law today as we consider betrothal. We're going to pick up details from several texts and then just kind of try to tie everything together at the end as we consider marriage. We're going to look at a case study in the prophets. Let's start with the law. In Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 and 17, we read, "If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins." Now, notice here that betrothal requires the payment of a bride price. Now, we'll see a little bit more about bride prices and dowries as we go along, but let's just note here that the bride price is essentially surety paid by the groom, the prospective groom, whereas the dowry is paid by the father of the bride. And notice the way that the law plays out that we've just read in Exodus 22. What we talked about last week helps us understand what's going on here. The seducer, in this case, has taken away the woman's ability to guarantee legitimate children to any other man. We're going to see later on that premarital virginity was essentially the way in antiquity in which a woman could guarantee a prospective husband that she would be faithful to him and provide him with legitimate heirs during the marriage. So in the case of the law that we've just read in Exodus 22, that guarantee is gone. The man has taken that from her. And so in exchange, the man has to pony up surety for her and has to marry her, obligating him to take care of her forever. Remember, in the ancient context, the model is that the man is essentially sole breadwinner, legally responsible for everybody in his household. In the ancient world, if you don't have if you're not part of a household with a father over it, then you're in really dire straits. So having to marry the woman and take care of her, again, is a great amount of obligation. The only person that can save him from this obligation is the girl's father. And in this case, the law gives the father of the young woman the greatest amount of flexibility in order to allow him to decide what's best for his daughter, right? It could be that, hey, the circumstances are bad, but this young man can provide for her, and so let's get that done. Or it could be that the father of the young girl determines, no, this guy is just complete sleaze and not even in the interest of providing for my daughter am I going to let her marry this man. But see how the law takes the general interests of both men and women into consideration. And remember, the romantic aspect that we tie to modern relationships is basically non-existent in antiquity. Right? That's not a motivating factor. It doesn't mean, by the way, that husbands and wives in the ancient world didn't develop affection for each other. Right? We see that happening all over the Old Testament. It just wasn't the basis for the relationship. It wasn't the thing that got the relationship started and drove it along. In any event, the young woman is likely never going to choose her own husband. Right? If this law strikes you as unfair, just remember in the ancient context, the young woman's never going to choose her own husband. Her father's going to do the choosing for her anyway. Again, in an ancient context, she's probably not even interested in choosing her own husband. Security is the primary interest in antiquity. And so in this case, the law is protecting the woman's interest against the interests of this man who has come in and seduced her. Coming back to the subject of betrothal, I just want you to file this away, that betrothal usually requires the payment of a bride price, and that marriage is the expected result. Right? This guy is going to get married to this woman. The law says that the man shall take the woman to be his wife. Now, we learn in other places in the law that betrothal differs from marriage in one essential regard. We can read in a couple of places, for example, Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 and 24, that speaks of a man lying with a betrothed virgin. It's about distinguishing between rape and consensual fornication. So we're going to just note that the betrothed woman in that case is a virgin. And we'll come back and deal specifically with that law whenever we study rape later on in the course. Instead, I want us to focus our attention on Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 5 through 7. This is in the context of Israel going out to war and certain exceptions that are made for men serving in the military whenever they go out to war. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 5 through 7. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, Is there any man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man dedicate it. And is there any man who has planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man enjoy its fruit. And is there any man who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man take her. All right, and imagine having that kind of exemption today. All right, if you're a young man of fighting age, and Israel's about to go off to war, and you have just gotten betrothed, you are exempt. Right? And for the first year after your marriage, you are exempt from service as well, so that you can raise up offspring for yourself. Not the kind of exceptions that we see in today's military. But look at what the laws have in common, and what they tell us about betrothal. The major difference between betrothal and marriage in antiquity is consummation. That's really the sole difference. In betrothal, the relationship is not consummated. In marriage, it is. The difference is not commitment, by the way, unlike in a modern engagement. In a modern engagement, if one party or the other gets cold feet, you can break the engagement off for practically any reason with very few penalties. In fact, at most points during the engagement, you can break the relationship off with really no penalty outside of the emotional penalties involved. It's really only whenever you get close to the marriage itself and you're already lining up venues and catering and things like that that you could end up losing out. But otherwise, an engagement is not a legal commitment at all. Right? The law is not going to get involved in that at all, except for, again, the contracts that you make with caterers and venues and things like that. Marriage changes that. Right? In the eye of the law, marriage is different. Marriage is the point where you become legally committed to the other person. And divorce carries penalties even under the sort of godless system that we have today. Even with no-fault divorce, as it were, there are still penalties for filing for divorce and carrying that through to its conclusion. Right? In antiquity, there's not that distinction. In the ancient world, betrothal is a legal commitment. And by the way, this is why the scriptures often conflate betrothal with marriage. You'll see them used, they're associated freely. We'll just say that. Where you will see marriage referred to as betrothal. We'll see that specifically in Hosea later on in today's study, where the Lord talks about betrothing Israel to himself, and he's talking about marriage. Right? He's not saying that he's going to stay in a state of perpetual engagement with Israel, but he takes Israel on as his bride. But the legal commitment of betrothal is signified by the paying of the bride price, like we read about in Exodus 22. That's why we have called it surety. Right? If a man chooses to call off his betrothal, usually he's going to lose the bride price. Right? Even in liberal cases, he's not going to get the whole bride price back. There are going to be deductions and penalties taken out of that, mostly for food. But in a lot of ancient law, you find that the young man loses the entire thing. All right, that, at the very least, is how we find it playing out in the broader ancient Near East. We don't have laws dealing specifically with that in the Law of Moses, but we can take some examples from the laws of Hammurabi. Right, this is what Hammurabi says. If a man who has the ceremonial marriage prestation brought to the house of his father-in-law, and who gives the bride wealth, should have his attention diverted to another woman, and declare to his father-in-law, I will not marry your daughter, then the father of the daughter shall take full legal possession of whatever had been brought to him. Right, and likewise, if the father of the bride calls off the betrothal, then the bride price has to be returned to the prospective groom. So we read again from Hammurabi. If a man has the ceremonial marriage prestation brought to the house of his father-in-law, and gives the bride wealth, and the father of the daughter then declares, I will not give my daughter to you, he shall return twofold everything that had been brought to him. Right, so we find that betrothal is legally binding in the ancient world, and that it is enforced through the bride price. Now, when we find the bride price appear in the Law of Moses without any further explanation of it, right, the assumption is that Israel already understands how a bride price works. Right, Israel would have understood the bride price to work as usual, as it were. So that's essentially how betrothal works. Very similar in some ways to modern engagement. It's a transitional relationship where the expected result is marriage, except the commitment is stronger, the commitment is legally binding, and the only difference between betrothal and marriage is that you don't have the consummation of the relationship yet. Otherwise, we should also note these things, as we've alluded to, are generally set up by parents, right? And we've alluded to this a little bit in previous classes, that in the ancient world you don't find relationships being managed based on unrestrained free choice, right? So I would not be able to go out and just, date around and find somebody that I like and settle down. No, it would be, my parents would be looking for a prospective spouse for me, and they would be dealing with somebody else. They would be dealing with the young woman's parents, and it would all be arranged. But then it would be my job as the groom to bring in a bride price. It would be the father-in-law's job to provide a dowry, and those things essentially act as an insurance policy for the woman. Right? And by the way, this kind of flips on its head that idea that ancient law is just completely anti-woman. In some ways, ancient law was, right? Let's not get that wrong. Modern law does a lot to protect women, but ancient law certainly did as well, just within its own context. And the bride price and the dowry are both designed specifically to protect the young woman, to protect her from capriciousness, both from the man who's wanting to marry her and from her own father. Right? Well, however this thing turns out, the young woman is going to have something to provide for herself. She's going to land on her feet. At least that's the idea. It's not how it always plays out in the ancient world, but that's how it's designed. Now, as for marriage itself, the law tells us precisely nothing, meaning that we have no sense for what a marriage ritual looks like in Israel. right? We've got an idea of what the ritual itself looks like today, right? Bride in a white dress, the father gives the bride away, all of those things. You got the exchanging of rings and vows. We don't really have any sense from the law of Moses what a marriage ritual would have looked like in ancient Israel. And there is a broad enough variety in the ancient Near East that it wouldn't be particularly helpful to dig into the customs of other nations here. So for the ritual itself, we're just going to pass that by and get into the actual relationship itself. Part of the reason, by the way, why we don't see the ritual regulated, well, I suspect anyway, is that's not really the problematic part. Remember, the law focuses on problems. It focuses on what people are actually doing, and it focuses on fixing those things. And so it's no surprise that most of what the law of Moses has to say about marriage has to do with problems in the marriage, especially infidelity. So let's turn our attention there now. At its absolute simplest, the law just flatly forbids infidelity. It keeps it super, super simple. And it needs to be this simple. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. It just says, don't commit adultery. Right? I think a lot of our English translations kind of gussy it up. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Get really verbose with it. In Hebrew, it's only 2 words. Right? And one of them is no. It's don't. And they've got a verb that means to commit adultery. It is as simple as it can get. Just don't do it. All right? But as we have seen throughout our study, the law knows that people are going to go wrong. And so it seeks to address common wrongdoings. Now, as we're going to see throughout the rest of our study, the general solution for infidelity is death. All right, here's a good example, a nice short one. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. Right, now this law is assuming that it's consensual fornication. There are other places in the law that provide tests for distinguishing, what's consensual versus what's rape. And we'll come to those whenever we study rape later on. But the assumption is, if you have both parties involved and willing, then both of them are going to die. Right? And again, Deuteronomy 22:22 keeps it real short and simple. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The law's concern with infidelity includes deception beforehand regarding whether or not the woman was a virgin. Right? And this is where the law of Moses differs from modern law. Right? Generally, whenever we're talking about adultery, we limit that just to discussions of marriage. Right? So if someone has premarital sex and then they become engaged and then become married, we generally don't talk about that situation as if that person had cheated on their spouse. Right now, we still talk about it as sin, but we typically don't use the language of adultery to talk about it. The law does. The law considers at least, we'll just read the law. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we'll start in verse 13. If a man takes a wife and goes into her and then hates her and accuses her of misconduct and brings a bad name upon her, saying, I took this woman, and when I came near her I did not find in her evidence of virginity, then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. And the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man to marry, and he hates her. And behold, he has accused her of misconduct, saying, I did not find in your daughter evidence of virginity. And yet this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloak before the elders of the city. Then the elders of that city shall take the man and whip him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give them to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name upon a virgin of Israel. And she shall be his wife. He may not divorce her all his days. But if the thing is true, that evidence of virginity was not found in the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done an outrageous thing in Israel by whoring in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Now, notice, by the way, in our study, we're interested in marriage, and we're talking about infidelity. Notice, though, that the beginning of this law is not focused on, at least not first off, not primarily focused on the problem of infidelity. It's focused first off on the problem of a man hating his wife. And the law is not one-sided here, right? It's not just assuming, the husband is just innocent, it must be a problem with the wife. It presents it as a two-sided issue. The law recognizes that, maybe the bride, maybe she wasn't a virgin, and that the groom has a legitimate complaint. Or, on the other hand, it could just be that the groom simply hates his wife and is using infidelity as an excuse. And so in the law, it falls to the family of the bride to produce evidence. Usually, our English translation said cloak. It would be a garment or a sheet, some cloth of some kind, usually with blood on it. And that would be the evidence of the daughter's virginity. And bear in mind, by the way, the law has just said that the man is going to take his complaint to the elders, and the evidence has to be brought out to the elders in the city gate. This is a big public spectacle. Right? This is a huge to-do. This accusation is being made very publicly, and the punishment, whichever way it goes, and whenever you trigger this law, it's going to go one way or the other. Either the husband is going to get beat and he's going to pay a fine, and again, this is going to happen publicly, or the woman is going to be put to death, and then again, that's going to happen publicly. And the thing that we should get from that is that marriage in the ancient world and in ancient Israel is primarily a public institution. It is not primarily a private institution, right? Which is kind of how we think of it today, right? Like, my marriage is my marriage, mind your own business, that sort of thing. The libertarian perspective on marriage is, why does the state need to be involved at all? And again, I'll just note, as I have been noting, that this class is descriptive in nature, not prescriptive, so I'm not talking about how things should be. But we should just note here that the law of Moses takes a different perspective on the public role of marriage than we might in the modern day. So in the law presents marriage as a public institution. It's something that the public is interested in, not just curious about, but it benefits the public or is a detriment to the public, depending on how it plays out. All right, but the law is concerned not just with infidelity during the marriage, but also deception about the state of the woman's virginity. Whether the bride is lying about it or the groom is lying about it, the law settles it out. Now, of course, these kinds of concerns about sexual fidelity extend through the life of the marriage. We saw that with Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, that if a man's found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. We also see it in Numbers chapter 5, in what we refer to as the Sota ordeal. Now, the thing is, we went over the Sota ordeal in August of last year when we were studying through the book of Numbers. And I'm going to provide if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to provide a link to that video down in the description of this video. if you're looking at this, on the website or listening on the website, just go back into our classes from the Law of Moses in August of 2019, and you'll find one on Numbers chapters 5 and 6, and we discuss the Sotah ordeal there. And I don't want to go through all of that material all over again. It's a pretty lengthy section. The short of it is that the law provides a test for suspected adultery where there is no proof. Right? So Deuteronomy 22, they're caught in the act. In Numbers chapter 5, there's no witness. There's no evidence. And so the law tells us that the spirit of jealousy comes over the husband, and he suspects his wife of infidelity. And it presents a test to determine whether or not the woman has been unfaithful. And the short of it is that ultimately God renders the judgment. Now, the type of judgment that he renders is important. But we'll have more to say on that in just a second. The only thing that I want to add, on top of what we already said back in August, is that the Sotah ordeal is consistent with the sorts of things that we read elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern law. Right? So this is not just something that comes out of the blue in Moses. Let's consider Hammurabi again. If a man's wife should have a finger pointed against her in accusation involving another male, although she has not been seized lying with another male, she shall submit to the divine river ordeal for her husband. All right, so this is practically a summary of the Sotah ordeal. You read through Numbers chapter 5, and what we just read here in the Laws of Hammurabi essentially summarizes that. There's no evidence. She's not been seized in the act. There's just suspicion. And so, because of that suspicion, the wife has to undergo an ordeal where God decides. Right? Even in the pagan world, again, they misunderstand who God is, but they understand that true judgment can only come from the divine. Right? It's one of those places where the pagans kind of sort of get it right, but they're, off in the ways that really matter. But again, we see that this kind of thing, an ordeal involving water, is fairly common in the ancient world. So now, we've got a basic understanding of how these things would have worked, how the law dealt with these issues of infidelity. The only challenge to our picture of the adultery laws, as we've seen them so far, is what we read about the certificate of divorce. So let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 24. We're going to read the first 4 verses. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. And I know that's probably one of the longest sentences in our English Bibles. Hopefully you were able to follow the gist of what's going on. And this tells us a lot about how the law is going to treat divorce and remarriage. But for now, I want us to consider the situation that leads to the divorce. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. Well, what's the indecency? What does indecency mean? By the time of Jesus, the common, or at least one common interpretation of this, basically means anything. Right? Because if you try hard enough, you can explain anything away as an indecency. And that's what a lot of Jews in the Second Temple period had done. Remember what the Pharisees asked Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, verse 3, The Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" And they have this particular law in mind, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. We know that because later they ask, well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? So this is the law that they have in mind, and their question is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Right, the anything interpretation of the law is obviously wrong. Right? Jesus sets them straight on that. And the indication that we get from there is that the indecency is sexual impropriety, right? Like adultery. In fact, we see this law at work earlier on in the Gospels, whenever Joseph discovers that Mary is with child. Right? They're betrothed, they're not married yet. But remember that betrothal is binding, and remember that the law is concerned with premarital infidelity, and that the law tends to, again, kind of associate freely between betrothal and marriage. And so Joseph discovers, while they're betrothed, yet before they have formally married, that Mary is with child. And so Joseph, you'll remember, chooses to deal with things quietly. He decides he's going to send Mary away instead of dealing with it publicly. Now, we've read laws that would work in both directions, right? Deuteronomy 24, you get the certificate of divorce, and the woman goes out, and that can be handled quietly, right? Whereas what we saw in Deuteronomy 22, that has to be handled publicly, and again, everybody knows about it. Right, because the parents have to be dragged into it, the elders are dragged into it, they're bringing out bloody garments. There's no way to do that quietly. Joseph chooses to deal with things quietly, not wanting to dishonor Mary. And the point is that it looks like there is some sexual impropriety going on. And an angel of the Lord, at least from Joseph's perspective, that's what it looks like. And an angel of the Lord has to step in to assure Joseph that there's not any impropriety and that he should not send Mary away. All right, now, all of this, if you've been keeping score, as it were, we started this lesson by pointing out from Deuteronomy 22:22 that in cases of adultery where the woman is married or betrothed, that the penalty is death. Deuteronomy 24, we have the certificate of divorce, where some indecency is found in the woman, and that indecency we can only interpret as being some sexual impropriety. And there, the solution, as it were, is the certificate of divorce. So why is it that Deuteronomy 24 prescribes a certificate of divorce when some of the other laws prescribe death? We should also note, by the way, that the Sotah ordeal of Numbers 5 also does not end in death. Right? If it turns out that the woman is guilty, she actually has been unfaithful to her husband, the penalty is that the woman becomes infertile. Right? We read that in Numbers chapter 5, verse 27. There's no mention of death in the Sotah ordeal. So we've got some laws that say death. We've got some that say otherwise. So how do we square that circle, as it were? Let's come at this from a couple of different angles. First, let's consider later oral interpretation of the law within Judaism. All right, because obviously we're not the only ones to notice this. I don't want to call it an inconsistency, this difference between some of the laws. The common interpretation that you find is that death is the maximum penalty for adultery, and that it is not the necessary penalty for adultery. We do this in modern law, by the way, where we have sentencing guidelines built into the law. And so, you get convicted of a crime, and the judge can sentence you within a range of options. Excuse me. Right, that's why there are debates about things like mandatory minimum sentences, because pretty much all law has a range of sentences available to it for the judge's discretion. And so the common interpretation of this is that, well, we're just seeing in different parts of the law the different ends of the spectrum. All right, and by the way, this is the oral interpretation of pretty much all of the laws in the Torah that call for death, especially because Israel often finds itself in situations where it can't enforce the death penalty, such as when it's under Roman occupation. And by the way, that should color your reading of the Gospels, that it's supposed to be hard, if not impossible, for Israel to execute someone under Roman rule. And yet their animosity towards Jesus is so great that they go for it anyway. All right. In Talmud Sanhedrin, for example, it is said that a Sanhedrin, that is a law court, a Sanhedrin that puts one person to death in 7 years is bloodthirsty. Right? So the norm is that you find other ways of handling things apart from the death penalty. So under this interpretation, the normal penalty would be divorce or something like the Sota ordeal, with the death penalty being reserved for extraordinary cases, say where there are aggravating circumstances. This is consistent also with what we read in other ancient Near Eastern law. So we'll return to Hammurabi one last time. If a man's wife should be seized lying with another male, they shall bind them and cast them into the water. If the wife's master allows his wife to live, then the king shall allow his subject, that is the other man, to live. Right? So here we see that death is the maximum penalty, but not the necessary penalty. So it could be that the law of Moses is just doing the same thing. We get a range of penalties, with death being the maximum but not necessary penalty. The caveat, of course, is that those are not biblical sources, but things that help us to make an educated guess. Now, I think it's a good educated guess because of what we read later on in the Scriptures. We're going to close today by considering a case study from the prophets, and I hope it's going to tie a lot of the things together that we have talked about today. The prophet Hosea is given a uniquely unpleasant task in his ministry. Look at Hosea chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now, as we have seen from the laws, and as we have seen from just what we've learned about antiquity in general, this is a highly unusual situation. God is asking Hosea to do something that no normal man would ever want to do in antiquity. You would never think of taking this kind of woman to be your wife. There's not a chance that your children are going to be legitimate. Right? You're going to be passing your inheritance down to who knows, right? Who knows whose kid that is that you're going to be passing your inheritance down to. It's going to leave your family. Right? This kind of situation just screams against every kind of instinct that an ancient man would have. And yet the Lord says, this is what you're going to do. Go take a wife of whoredom for yourself and have children with her. We learn immediately what the point of it is. It is an object lesson about Israel's relationship with God. And that's the normal way that God uses marriage in the Scriptures. It's an object lesson to teach us about our relationship to Him. Now let's see what lesson God teaches through Hosea's marriage to Gomer. In Hosea chapter 1, and we're not going to read through the whole thing, we'll just summarize. Gomer bears Hosea 3 children, and God gives them names. The first one is Jezreel, which signifies God's punishment for the blood of Jezreel. He names the second child No Mercy, and the third child Not My People. Right? And I'm not going to explain those names. I think they speak for themselves. Hosea chapter 2 traces God's relationship with Israel. All right, so the object lesson is kind of put in the background, and what God is really wanting to talk about comes to the foreground. Israel has gone astray after other lovers, but God is going to separate her from those other lovers forcibly, and is going to bring her back to himself. This is what he says in Hosea chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Now remember, though, the object lesson for this is Hosea's marriage to Gomer. And it turns out, right, and this is, I think this is an interesting thing from like a literary perspective. The text turns our attention away from Hosea and Gomer's marriage to focus on God's relationship with Israel. But in the meanwhile, again, the background, we find that the same thing that God has been talking about in his relationship with Israel has happened in Hosea's relationship with Gomer. Gomer has been unfaithful to Hosea and has run off with another man after having these 3 children. And in Hosea chapter 3, God tells Hosea to do something that is as unusual as his call in Hosea 1 was. What he tells Hosea to do in Hosea chapter 3 is just, it's completely extraordinary and unthinkable. Even more so than what we saw in chapter 1. Hosea chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord said to me, Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer and a lathek of barley. And I said to her, You must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore, or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. In an ancient context, this is absolutely astounding. Even just within the context of the law. Right, compare what's just happened here to what we read about in the law of Moses. According to the law, what should happen to Gomer? We've got some options. What are your sentencing options? Right, if you're on the Sanhedrin and Hosea were to come before you and tell you about what Gomer has done, what are your options? All right, she, according to the law, she either needs to die or she needs to be sent out permanently. Remember, that's what Deuteronomy 24 requires, that she be sent out and that she can't come back. But God has Hosea take her back. Again, that's completely astounding. And not only that, but Hosea buys her back for a ludicrous sum, right? About 1/3 of a pound of silver and 9 bushels of barley. Just an absurd price. And as we've seen in the ancient world, a woman like Gomer is not worth that. Right? You wouldn't pay a penny for a woman like Gomer in the ancient world. But God has Hosea do that to demonstrate his own love and mercy towards us, his wayward people. And again, keep any notion of modern romance out of this. This is not a romance story. This is not told from the perspective of Gomer at all. Hosea is not chasing Gomer down because she has captured his heart or because she's high value. It's exactly the opposite. Hosea is chasing her down despite who she is. because God has told him to. God doesn't chase us down because we're high value. Right? He tells Israel that explicitly. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Israel. We read likewise in Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 through 6, Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations the Lord your God is driving them out before you, that he might confirm the word that the Lord spoke to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. God redeems his people because it's in his nature to do so. That's it. It's not because there's anything attractive about his people. He does it because he is a loving God. And the law tells us what we deserve for our infidelity. The prophets tell us that God gives us way better than we deserve. And again, it's not because of anything in us. I hope that study today has been edifying and helpful to you. We're going to continue our study next week. I think we'll look at divorce and remarriage a little bit. We've essentially seen, though, most of what there is to see in Deuteronomy 24. So we'll spend maybe a brief time at the beginning of next week on that, and then we'll move on to inheritance and explain how that works. Because remember, all of this, everything that we've been talking about, the whole process of finding a prospective spouse and going through the betrothal and getting married is to produce legitimate heirs to leave your inheritance to. So we'll talk about the inheritance next week, how important that is, and how it is left to people in the ancient world. So until next time, I hope that you all do well. Bye-bye.